this is Miss Rachel from the Lorraine Public Library System, and this is part 3 of our 4-part series about making comics. So this part I call the actually making the comic part. We're going to be talking about the key things that separate comics from other types of books and other types of art. So let's get started.
So what exactly are comics? Comics are the most common form of sequential art. And sequential art is just separate images put in a particular order to tell a story or give some sort of information. So of course you're going to have art, but you can also combine symbols and words in order to get that information across more easily. You don't have to include any words or text in your comic, and in that case it would be a silent comic. So comics are a little bit similar to movies and animation in that time is the most important aspect. There's some kind of story or information being told over a period of time. But what makes it different is it's those separate images rather than with a movie or animation being played over top each other. So when you're thinking of a single panel comic like The Far Side, technically that's going to be a cartoon because it's just one single image. You might be thinking that comics are a newfangled thing, or that they're pretty modern, but really the history goes back quite a long ways. So think of Egyptian wall paintings. It combines large paintings along with hieroglyphics in order to give you some sort of information. So in that case, they could be considered a very early version of comics. Since this definition is so broad, there are a lot of things you might be surprised could be considered a comic. So what makes comics useful, especially as a tool for communication, is you can break things down into icons or symbols in order to help people understand more of what you're trying to say. In this way, comics are actually really similar to graphic design in how they're trying to communicate to people as clearly as possible. So, for instance, look at these two coffee cups. So we know the top one is a photograph, it's a picture, and we can kind of guess is some sort of coffee is inside it. Now with the bottom one, we get a little bit more information, even though it's much more simplified than a photograph. So we see that there are coffee beans, so maybe the coffee is fresh because we have some coffee beans nearby. We also know for sure that it's coffee because it's labeled on the front of the mug. And we see there's a brown liquid, so we know it's probably coffee in its liquid form. And we have little wisps of heat coming off the top. So it's telling us that this coffee is hot. So we're actually getting much more information from the little icon on the right than the actual photograph that we would take in real life. Now that we have a bit of an understanding of what is and what isn't a comic, we can start talking about the different parts of a comic that make it what it is. And the first thing we can talk about is comic panels. So comic panels are going to be a single frame or drawing among many others, so it has to be more than one. They usually tell a story through a series of pictures and text, but sometimes they don't need any words at all. They are like a snapshot in time, a single moment. Some panels do include more than one moment in time, but those are a little bit more complicated and definitely more uncommon. So usually one frame is one single moment. So you can get really creative with the different types of panels that you use. They can be any shape or size. They can overlap or seem to float. Things can overlap in and outside of the panel, so someone could say, break the border of the panel, and then some panels don't even have any border at all, so you can have that option too. There are double page spreads or panels that take up more than one page, so that's another option that you have as far as panels go. So how do you read comic panels? Comics, like books, read from left to right, top to bottom, and the speech bubbles in each panel are going to follow the same exact pattern, which usually ends up becoming a Z-like pattern. So for manga, it's actually going to be quite the opposite. So you're going to be going from right to left, top to bottom, because this is how Japanese is read and written. So some manga volumes that you'll find that are written in English or translated to English are going to give a little bit of a warning on the wrong side of the book, telling you, hey, this is the wrong side of the book. You gotta go around to the other side. And they'll give you a nice visual to kind of show you how it's different from normal Western comics. It's important to make panels easy to follow so your readers don't get confused or frustrated. Simple formats can be less inspired or less interesting, but they make for an easy read. More complex layouts can be interesting, but run the risk of losing your reader. So let's take a look at a couple of quick examples. So for this first one, it's just a normal, typical comic strip, left to right, top to bottom, with both the panels and the speech bubbles. So this is going to be a very easy format. The next is a little bit more complicated, but not too much more. It's just adding a couple of extra levels and a few different sizes. And now we're going to be following that Z pattern. Again, pretty easy, but a little bit more complex than the one before. And last, we're going to take a look at this more complex one. So some things are overlapping, things are a little bit of different sizes, different shapes, but again, we're going to be following that exact same pattern, and it is not too difficult to follow. So let's take a look at this final panel page. So we can see at the top, it seems pretty straightforward. We're going from the left and then going down again, starting that Z pattern. But once we get to the bottom, it's kind of weird. Do you keep going to the right or do you go down? It's a little bit confusing. You can probably make it through, and depending on what is actually in the panels, it might seem more obvious, but this one might be a little bit more confusing. So this layout is actually one of the common culprits for causing a confusing reading experience for comics. So some percentage of people are going to read one way, and some percentage of people are going to read the other way. There are actually studies that are done on different comic layouts, including this one, to try to see where people get confused and maybe what are some better ways to lay out your comic pages. If you're not sure if your comic layout makes sense or is easy to follow, there's usually two ways to kind of see what the best way to go about it. First is just to ask friends and family, hey, can you read this? Does this make sense to you? And another thing you can do is take a look at some professional comics, see the way that they laid out their particular pages. Does that make sense? Is it a little bit confusing? It'll help you figure out what you'd like to do. The gutter is the space between panels, and it's usually going to be a completely blank area. So the gutter helps us know that something is happening in each panel at a different moment in time. So it could be seconds, it could be minutes, it could be years, it could be entire millennia. That's what's so magical about it. Your mind fills in the blanks as to what is happening between the two moments. Let's take a look at this example a little more closely. So we see someone's on a run home. It's a nice day. We only are given a very limited amount of information. So they could be saying this in the course of a few seconds, or maybe throughout the duration of their whole run. You don't know. So what could happen in between these two moments? So here are two versions of the same comic and what I put in between those panels. Now, that might not be what you imagined at all for this character's run to be like, because there are an infinite number of possibilities of what could happen. This is what makes the gutter amazing, is because it makes you a participant, and you get to decide what happens in your head. When things are left to the imagination, anything could happen. So I could have just chosen more than one panel in order to put between those two. I could have done 100, I could have done 1,000,000. So think about editing and choosing your frames in the same way that an editor does for a movie. There are things that you can show and things that you can leave out. So when you're adding more panels, you're going to be adding more information, but you'll be slowing down the pace of the story. And then when you are taking panels away, you are going to make things speed up a bit more. But then the reader has to make the connections in their brain as to what's going on if it's not explained on the page. So next we're going to move on to comic effects. So these are speech bubble sound effects and motion. So there are a lot of different types of speech bubbles, but generally they show us what someone is saying. So if you made a script, it makes it really easy to just take those lines of dialogue and just put them right into those speech bubbles. Now, speech bubbles are not actually in the scene, which would be really cool if speech bubbles existed in real life and we could see what we're saying up in the air like that. But sometimes some comics do break the fourth wall by saying, hey, there's a bubble above my head. So you can use that for comedic effect if you'd like to do that. So one of the most important things about speech bubbles is the tail. So the speech bubble tail is that little pointy end that points towards the person who is speaking. So the tail usually points to someone that's in frame, but sometimes it doesn't point to anyone at all, or someone out of frame, so that can add a little bit of mystery to your scene. Try not to cross tails because usually this can confuse the reader, and it's best to keep them separate when possible. With comics, there are going to be a couple of special speech bubbles. So any ones that happen to look like a cloud are usually going to mean thinking or dreaming. Ones that have jagged edges are usually going to mean shouting or a loud noise. And then if there's multiple lines of dialogue, usually they're going to be put in bubbles that are piled on top of each other or connected via little lines so that you know it's being said by one person. Another particular type of speech bubble is for some sort of narration. So usually these are contained in a box or don't have any border at all. They're simply somewhere in the panel. So these are usually reserved for characters that either are not pictured or maybe not part of the story at all. They're just giving background information none of the characters would know. Or sometimes it's just overlaid over the scene, showing that a character is having some kind of internal thought about what's happening. Speech bubbles and text are another fun way to play with style with your comic. So maybe a certain character has a certain personality, so their speech bubble and text style reflects that. Maybe they have a certain feeling like they're cold, so it looks like there's icicles. With text, you can either try using a different type of handwriting, or if you're on a computer, you can just simply change the font. Just remember that normal round speech bubbles are going to work perfectly well, and that way you can keep things a little bit more simple. Next, we'll talk about sound effects. So, sound effects, as the name implies, help us hear what's happening in a comic. And this written word for a sound is called onomatopoeia. So when you're writing text as a sound effect, this can be stylized to kind of reflect the type of sound that's being made. There are also other ways you can show sound effects other than just text or speech bubbles. So you can use motion lines to kind of show that there's something happening, like an explosion or maybe just popping bubble wrap. Or you can use motion lines and text to kind of make the shape of what the sound would be like. Say like a kettle on the stove is going to go scree until someone comes to turn off the heat. And in speaking of motion, there are motion lines that you can use. So motion lines help to show action, or as the name implies, some sort of fast, swift movement. So you can show the literal movement of something and the path it takes, such as swinging a baseball bat, or maybe the impact of something, so something hitting against one another. Then you can also show vibrations, say if someone is shivering, or maybe there's some kind of earthquake, something like that, or someone getting hit in the hand with a baseball. Ouch. Now we have more of an idea of how comic panels work and a little bit more about the special effects and icons that we can use in comics. We can talk about arranging all those pieces together on the page through composition. So, what is composition? Composition is the way that elements of an image are arranged on the page. So, more simply, that means where you put stuff on the page. So, composition includes all the characters, objects, and backgrounds that you're including in your comic. So, think of composition like moving a camera around as a movie director. You get to decide where the shots are, where everyone stands, where everything goes, and how exactly the camera is going to see each thing. So it can tilt, turn, and move in any direction. So let's take a look at some of the most common views your camera can take. Composition when it comes to light and value are some other things you might want to think about. So what's the mood of your comic? Is it happy? Is it scary? So how dark or light would it be? When you're coloring something, even with just graphite, dark or light areas are going to stand out based on whatever the values are around them. So something light will stand out in the darkness, and something dark is going to stand out when something is very bright. So color is going to work a very similar way. Say a warm color like red is probably going to stand out when surrounded by cool colors, say like blue and green. Another thing about color that you can use to your advantage is some colors have an unconscious meaning. So say red is dramatic, bold, angry, and calls attention to itself. So you might choose colors that make people feel a certain way when they read it. Something to keep in mind is that we read from left to right, so often we see action moving from the same direction. If something is moving right, it seems like they're going towards something. If they're going to the left, it might seem like they are traveling backwards or going back home. Here are some other composition questions you might want to ask yourself. What looks balanced or unbalanced if that's what you're going for? Does something draw your eye away or to the thing you're trying to focus on? What would someone else see for the first time? Is that what I want them to see? How would someone feel if they saw this? Is this the effect I'm going for? There's a lot more to be said about composition, and so there is a lot more to learn. This is just a good starting point, and just know that composition is definitely not mastered overnight. Whether you've scripted your comic already or not, thumbnails are a great way to plan out your comic's pages. If you already have a script, you can more easily start thumbnailing your panels. Thumbnails are quick, small sketches that show the basic composition, lighting, and panel layout for your comic. They are quick and easy to read. There are usually no little details, just big ideas. Thumbnailing helps you so you know what you will draw beforehand, which speeds up the process. It also helps so there's less erasing and redoing, which is always a plus. So these are some of my example thumbnails from my comic that shows just the basic layout of the pages, the shading, shapes, and text. And the text for this is just what I would be putting in the comic either through speech bubbles or through narration. So it isn't trying to explain the thumbnails. I've already done that with the script and outlines that I did before. I also numbered the pages and showed the basic movement and emotions and also a cover sketch for my comic. So when you're making your thumbnails, You don't necessarily even have to include all this detail. You can make it even more simple. And if you feel the thumbnailing stage is a good place to stop for your comic and you feel that it's finished at that point, that definitely works too.
So this ends the third part of our 4-part series about making comics. Today we really just talked about what makes a comic a comic. So next time we're going to go over a couple of drawing tips and how to go from sketch to finished product. So until next time, I'll see you then.